Dr. Elena Vasquez had interviewed 127 serial killers during her 20-year career, and she never expected the 128th to recognize her daughter's voice on a recording. The moment Thomas Crane's eyes lit up with familiarity while listening to her research audio was the moment Elena realized her life's work had put her family in unimaginable danger. Elena had built her reputation as one of America's leading criminal psychologists by developing an unprecedented access program with maximum security prisons across the country. Unlike other researchers who relied on written questionnaire or brief interviews, Elena spent months with each subject, building trust and extracting confessions that had never been shared with law enforcement. Her methodology was controversial but effective. She treated these monsters like human beings, and in return, they revealed their deepest secrets. The breakthrough that made her famous came during her third year of research, when she discovered what she called the Trinity pattern. Every serial killer she studied, regardless of their methods or motivations, shared three specific psychological markers that appeared in childhood: an obsession with control, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and most disturbingly, a specific type of recurring dream involving the sensation of watching themselves commit violence from outside their own body. Elena's research had helped law enforcement identify potential serial killers before they claimed their first victims. She had consulted on dozens of high-profile cases, testified in congressional hearings about criminal psychology, and authored 3 best-selling books that changed how society understood predatory behavior. But success came with a price. Elena had spent so much time inside the minds of killers that she sometimes struggled to connect with normal people, including her own teenage daughter, Maria. The problems at home had been building for months. Maria complained that her mother was distant and cold, more interested in her research subjects than her own family. Elena's husband, David, had grown tired of dinner conversations that revolved around murder techniques and psychological profiles. They didn't understand that Elena's work required her to maintain emotional distance from everyone, including them, because empathy was a luxury she couldn't afford when trying to understand the minds of people who viewed other humans as objects. Elena's latest research focus was on what she termed adaptive killers, serial murderers who evolved their methods over time to avoid detection. These subjects were intellectually superior to typical killers, often holding advanced degrees and maintaining successful careers while secretly hunting victims. They represented the most dangerous category of predator because they appeared completely normal to everyone around them, including their own families. Thomas Crane fit this profile perfectly. A former chemistry professor who had killed 17 people over 8 years using untraceable poisons. Crane had agreed to participate in Elena's study only after she convinced prison administrators to allow him access to chemistry journals and educational materials. Elena had been interviewing him for 3 months when she decided to test his psychological responses using audio recordings of emotional conversations. The recording she played was meant to be neutral, a conversation between a teenage girl and her friend discussing college applications and future plans. Elena had recorded the conversation herself, using her daughter Maria and her best friend as unknowing subjects, believing the content was too mundane to trigger any significant response from Crane. But as the recording played, Elena watched Crane's body language shift in ways that made her blood run cold. His breathing became shallow, his pupils dilated, and most terrifyingly, he began smiling, not the practiced smile he usually wore during their sessions, but something genuine and predatory. When Maria's voice came through the speakers discussing her acceptance to Northwestern University, Crane leaned forward with obvious excitement. "That's a beautiful voice," Crane said, his tone taking on a quality Elena had never heard from him before. Young, intelligent, probably brunette based on the vocal patterns. "She mentions Northwestern, that's in Chicago, isn't it? I used to do guest lectures there before my legal troubles." He paused, tilting his head as if listening for something specific. "She sounds like she'd be fun to teach. Very responsive to authority figures, I'd guess." Elena felt her professional composure cracking as she realized what was happening. Crane wasn't just responding to the recording, he was profiling the speaker. Worse, his interest seemed personal in a way that went far beyond clinical curiosity. Elena stopped the recording and tried to maintain her neutral researcher tone, but Crane had already noticed her discomfort. "Did I say something wrong, Dr. Vasquez?" Crane asked, his predatory smile widening. "You seem upset." "Don't worry, I'm just appreciating good research methodology. Though I have to say, using your own daughter's voice in psychological testing shows either remarkable dedication or questionable judgment. Which do you think it is?" Elena's heart stopped. She had never told Crane that Maria was her daughter. The recording contained no identifying information, no names, nothing that should have connected the voice to Elena personally. Yet somehow, Crane had made the connection immediately. Elena realized she was looking at something far more dangerous than an adaptive killer. She was facing a predator who had been studying her as intensively as she had been studying him. "I don't know what you mean," Elena said, but her voice betrayed her fear. Crane's expression shifted from predatory amusement to something that looked almost sympathetic, which somehow made everything worse. "Oh, Elena," Crane said, using her first name for the first time in 3 months of interviews. "You've been so focused on understanding what makes us tick that you forgot the most important rule of studying dangerous animals. Never let them know where you live." Elena gathered her materials with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. As she prepared to leave the interview room, Crane's voice followed her with a casual observation that would haunt her for weeks. "Maria's a lovely name, by the way. So much prettier than Subject 847, don't you think? I do hope she's careful walking alone at night in Chicago. College campuses can be so dangerous for young women who trust too easily." Elena left the prison that day knowing her life had fundamentally changed. For 20 years, she had studied monsters while believing she was safe behind institutional walls and professional protocols. Now she understood that she had never been the observer in these relationships. She had always been the prey. The question that kept her awake that night wasn't how Crane had identified Maria's voice, but how many other killers in her research database had been gathering information about her family while pretending to be cooperative subjects. As Elena drove home through the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every stranger on the street could be connected to one of her 127 previous subjects. Elena had spent her career learning how serial killers think, and now that knowledge was turning against her, showing her exactly how vulnerable she and her family had always been. Elena spent the next week discovering that her 20 years of research had created a network of killers who knew more about her personal life than her own colleagues did. When she began auditing her case files, she found evidence that her subjects had been systematically gathering intelligence on her family, her routines, and her vulnerabilities while she believed she was conducting objective psychological research. The revelation started with a call from the warden at Millfield Correctional, where Elena had interviewed dozens of subjects over the years. "Dr. Vasquez, we've had some unusual incidents since your last visit," Warden Patricia Hughes said, her voice tight with concern. "3 different inmates have been asking guards about your interview schedules, your travel arrangements, and whether you ever mentioned your daughter during sessions. They claim it's for research purposes, but—" Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized the scope of what she was dealing with. She had always been careful about maintaining professional boundaries and never sharing personal information during interviews. But over 20 years and hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, she had apparently revealed more about herself than she realized. These men were experts at reading people, at finding weakness and exploiting trust. They had been studying her as intensely as she had been studying them. Elena drove to Northwestern University that afternoon to check on Maria without calling first. She found her daughter in the library, surrounded by textbooks and seemingly unaware of any danger. But as Elena watched from across the room, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A middle-aged man sitting 3 tables away who appeared to be sketching Maria while pretending to read. Elena approached the man with her heart racing, prepared to confront him, but he vanished the moment he noticed her attention. She searched the library systematically, but found no trace of him except for the sketch pad he'd left behind. The drawings were detailed and disturbing, not just of Maria, but of Elena herself, her car, and even their house. At the bottom of the last page was a note in careful handwriting. "She looks just like her voice sounds. Thomas sends his regards." Elena called campus security immediately, but she knew they were dealing with something beyond their capabilities. She also knew she couldn't explain the full situation without revealing that her research had potentially put her daughter in danger. Instead, she told Maria they needed to have an urgent family meeting about safety precautions for college students, hoping to increase her daughter's awareness without causing panic. The family meeting that evening was the most difficult conversation Elena had ever had outside of a prison interview room. She tried to explain to David and Maria that her work might have attracted unwanted attention from dangerous people, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal the full extent of the threat. How do you tell your teenage daughter that serial killers have been collecting information about her for months or possibly years? "Mom, you're scaring me," Maria said, her voice small and confused. "Are you saying someone wants to hurt us because of your job?" Elena saw her own fear reflected in her daughter's eyes and realized she was facing an impossible choice: terrify her family with the truth or leave them vulnerable through ignorance. David's reaction was anger mixed with disbelief. "Elena, you've been working with these people for decades. If there was real danger, wouldn't it have surfaced before now?" But Elena could see the doubt in his eyes, the growing realization that he had never fully understood what his wife did behind prison walls or what kind of relationships she built with her subjects. Elena spent the next several days reviewing 20 years of interview transcripts, looking for any mention of her family or personal details that she might have overlooked. What she found was far worse than careless self-disclosure. It was evidence of systematic manipulation by subjects who had been playing a much longer game than she ever imagined. In interview after interview, Elena discovered that her subjects had been using subtle psychological techniques to extract personal information from her. They would share vulnerable stories about their own families, creating emotional intimacy that encouraged reciprocal sharing. They would express concern for her safety, leading her to mention security protocols. They would compliment her appearance or professionalism, prompting her to share details about her education, her background, her life outside the prison walls. The most disturbing discovery came in her files on Marcus Webb, a killer she had interviewed 5 years earlier, who was serving life without parole for murdering 8 women. Webb had been one of her most cooperative subjects, providing detailed insights into his psychological development and killing methods. But as Elena reread their conversations, she realized that Webb had been systematically gathering information about her research methods, her other subjects, and her personal life. In their 15th interview, Webb had asked what seemed like an innocent question about how Elena maintained her emotional balance while doing such difficult work. Her response, which she had completely forgotten, included details about her family being her anchor to normalcy, Maria's academic achievements helping her remember that good people exist, and David's support allowing her to continue her research without losing herself in darkness. Webb had followed up with seemingly supportive questions about Maria's college plans, whether Elena worried about her daughter's safety on campus, and how difficult it must be to balance motherhood with such demanding work. Elena had answered these questions thinking she was having a human moment with a subject who was showing genuine interest in her well-being. Now she realized she had been providing a detailed psychological and logistical profile to a predator who was already planning to use that information against her. The phone rang as Elena sat in her office at midnight, surrounded by evidence of her own professional failures. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed the number for Millfield Correctional. It was Thomas Crane, somehow calling from inside the maximum security prison. "Hello, Elena." Crane's voice was calm and friendly, as if they were old friends catching up. "I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I wanted to make sure you found Marcus's little gift at the library today. He's been so excited to contribute to your research, even from behind bars. You know how much we all appreciate the work you do." Elena's hands shook as she realized that the sketch artist at Northwestern hadn't been working alone. This was a coordinated effort involving multiple subjects from her research database, men who had been communicating with each other and planning something that went far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Elena hung up the phone and immediately called the FBI, knowing that her life's work had just become the foundation for the most dangerous game she had ever played. Elena's FBI contact, Agent Sarah Morrison, arrived at her house 12 hours after the phone call from Thomas Crane. But what she revealed about Elena's research subjects made 20 years of interviews seem like child's play compared to the sophisticated criminal network that had been growing right under her nose. The men Elena thought she had been studying in isolation had actually been using her research program as a communication hub, sharing information and coordinating activities across multiple states and prison systems. "Dr. Vasquez, we need to talk about the scope of what you've uncovered," Agent Morrison said as she spread photographs across Elena's dining room table. Each picture showed one of Elena's former research subjects, but these weren't prison mugshots. They were recent surveillance photos of men who should have been behind bars. 17 of your interview subjects have been released on parole, early release programs, or have escaped custody in the last 5 years. We didn't connect their releases until your call yesterday. Elena stared at the photographs with growing horror. She recognized every face, remembered every interview, every psychological profile she had compiled. Marcus Webb, who had provided such detailed insights into killer psychology, had been released on a technicality 18 months ago. David Hoffman, who had helped her understand victim selection methods, had escaped during a prison transport 6 months ago. Jeremy Castle, who had taught her about long-term planning in serial crimes, had been granted early release for good behavior just 3 weeks ago. They've been using your research sessions to plan their post-incarceration activities, Agent Morrison continued. We found evidence that they've been sharing information about law enforcement techniques, victim vulnerability assessments, and geographic hunting patterns. Your interviews gave them access to psychological insights from dozens of other killers, essentially creating a graduate-level education in predatory behavior. Elena realized she had inadvertently created a master class in serial killing with herself as the unwitting professor. Every technique she had learned from one subject, every psychological insight she had gained, every breakthrough in understanding killer mentality had been shared with other subjects through her comparative research approach. She had told Marcus Webb about Thomas Crane's poison methods, shared David Hoffman's victim selection strategies with Jeremy Castle, and provided each subject with a comprehensive overview of how their peers thought and operated. But the revelation that shattered Elena's remaining composure came when Agent Morrison showed her a series of documents recovered from a raid on Marcus Webb's apartment. Webb had been keeping detailed files on Elena's family for over 2 years, including photographs of Maria at school, David's work schedule, and floor plans of their house. The files also contained what appeared to be a training manual titled The Vasquez Method: Advanced Techniques for Predatory Research and Target Acquisition. Webb has been selling this information to other predators, Agent Morrison explained. Your research methodology, your psychological insights, and your family's personal information have become commodities in a network of criminals who view you as both a resource and a target. They call you the professor and consider access to your work a form of continuing education. Elena's legs gave out as she realized the full extent of her professional failure. She had spent 20 years believing she was helping law enforcement understand and catch serial killers, but instead she had been training them to become more effective predators. Every interview, every breakthrough, every published paper had made these men more dangerous than they would have been without her intervention. The phone rang again, and Elena's blood froze when she saw it was another call from inside a prison system. Agent Morrison gestured for Elena to answer while she activated recording equipment. This time, the voice belonged to Jeremy Castle, the recently released killer who had specialized in targeting college-age women. "Elena, darling." Castle's voice was warm and familiar, like a favorite uncle calling to check on the family. "I want to thank you personally for all the excellent training you provided over the years. Your insights into victim psychology have been invaluable now that I'm back in the field, so to speak. I particularly enjoyed our discussions about how young women respond to authority figures. It's made my current work so much more efficient." Elena forced herself to keep him talking while Agent Morrison traced the call. "Jeremy, where are you? What work are you referring to?" Elena's voice sounded steadier than she felt, her professional training kicking in despite her terror. Castle laughed, a sound that had once seemed harmless during their prison interviews but now carried obvious menace. "Oh, Elena, I can't discuss operational details. But I will say that your daughter's university has such interesting security protocols. Did you know that Maria takes the same route to the library every Tuesday and Thursday? Such a creature of habit, just like her mother. It's almost like she learned predictability from the best teacher in the family." Agent Morrison was frantically coordinating with local law enforcement through hand signals while Elena continued the conversation. "Jeremy, you need to stay away from my family. Whatever you think you learned from our interviews, it doesn't give you the right to." "Rights?" Castle interrupted, his tone shifting from friendly to cold. "Elena, you spent 5 years teaching me about rights. The right of the strong to hunt the weak, the right of the intelligent to prey on the trusting, the right of the prepared to take advantage of the unprepared. You gave me the psychological tools to understand these rights, and now you're upset that I'm exercising them. That seems a bit hypocritical, don't you think?" Elena realized she was listening to her own research philosophy being turned against her and her family. Every technique she had used to gain the trust of killers, every psychological insight she had developed, every professional boundary she had carefully maintained was being weaponized by men who had never forgotten that she was ultimately just another potential victim. The call ended with Castle's chilling promise. Give Maria my regards when you see her tonight. Oh, wait, you won't be seeing her tonight, will you? She's staying late at the library for her study group. Such a dedicated student, just like her mother. We'll talk again soon, Elena. I have so much more to thank you for. Agent Morrison immediately dispatched units to Northwestern University, while Elena called Maria's cell phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The phone went straight to voicemail, and Elena's message came out as barely controlled panic. Maria, this is an emergency. Do not go anywhere alone. Do not trust anyone you don't know. Call me immediately and stay with other people until I get there. As Elena and Agent Morrison raced toward the university, Elena understood that her 20-year career studying serial killers had led to this moment. A few others had led to this moment. Desperate race to save her daughter from predators she had trained herself. The most terrifying realization was that she had no idea how many other killers were already in position, how long they had been planning this, or whether her family had ever been safe during the decades she thought she was conducting objective research. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The student has become the teacher, and the teacher has become the prey. Welcome to Advanced Studies, Professor Vasquez. Class is now in session. Elena arrived at Northwestern University to find Maria's study group scattered and terrified, with campus security investigating what students described as men who had been asking detailed questions about specific students while claiming to be prospective parents touring the campus. Maria was missing, and the last anyone had seen her was when she left the library around 9 p.m. with a man who identified himself as a psychology professor interested in discussing her mother's research. Agent Morrison coordinated search efforts while Elena tried to piece together what had happened using the psychological profiling skills that had made her career. The description of the man who approached Maria matched Jeremy Castle perfectly, mid-50s, authoritative demeanor, wearing a university faculty jacket that would have given him instant credibility with students. Castle had used Elena's own professional reputation to gain access to her daughter, presenting himself as a colleague with legitimate academic interests. Elena's phone buzzed with a message containing an address and the words, "Come alone if you want to see what you've taught us. Bring the Morrison file from your research archives. You have 2 hours to decide whether your life's work was worth your daughter's life." Elena showed the message to Agent Morrison, who immediately began organizing tactical response while running traces on the location. "Dr. Vasquez, we cannot let you go alone," Agent Morrison said. "This is obviously a trap designed to get you to an isolated location where they have complete control." But Elena was already thinking like the killers she had studied for 20 years, understanding their need for psychological dominance and their desire to prove intellectual superiority over law enforcement. They don't want to kill Maria, Elena realized, the analysis coming together in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she had been solving her entire career. She's leverage to get me to participate in whatever they have planned. This isn't about revenge. It's about proving they learned from the best teacher they ever had. They want me to witness their graduation exercise. Elena understood that her research subjects had always seen her as more than just an interviewer. She had been their mentor, their guide into the deepest psychological territories of predatory behavior. Now they wanted to demonstrate that they had surpassed their teacher, that they could orchestrate something more sophisticated than anything she had studied or documented. Maria wasn't just a victim. She was the final exam. Against Agent Morrison's direct orders, Elena drove to the address alone, carrying the Morrison file that contained her most detailed research on killer psychology and victim manipulation. She understood that going alone was probably a death sentence, but she also knew that her subjects had spent years learning her psychological patterns and would anticipate law enforcement involvement. The only advantage she had was 20 years of understanding how these men thought, and she planned to use that knowledge to save her daughter and stop the network she had unknowingly created. The address led to an abandoned warehouse in an industrial district, but Elena recognized the location from her research. It was near the site where Marcus Webb had killed his first victim 15 years ago. As she entered the building, Elena realized she was walking into a carefully constructed psychological maze designed to demonstrate everything her subjects had learned from their interviews with her. The warehouse had been converted into a replica of her prison interview rooms, complete with recording equipment, observation windows, and multiple interrogation setups. Elena counted at least 6 different stations, each designed to simulate the research environment where she had conducted thousands of hours of interviews. But now she was no longer the researcher, she was the subject. Maria sat in the center of the space, apparently unharmed but clearly terrified, surrounded by 4 men Elena recognized immediately: Marcus Webb, Jeremy Castle, David Hoffman, and Thomas Crane, who had somehow managed to escape or be released since their last conversation. Each man stood behind a different interview station, as if prepared to conduct their own research session with Elena as the primary subject. "Welcome to our laboratory, Professor," Marcus Webb said, gesturing to the elaborate setup with obvious pride. "We've spent considerable time preparing for this dissertation defense. After all, we learned from the best that presentation and environment are crucial for effective psychological research." Elena realized she was looking at her own methodology being turned against her with surgical precision. Jeremy Castle stepped forward with a clipboard and recording device, mimicking Elena's interview preparation rituals with disturbing accuracy. "We're going to conduct a series of assessments to determine whether you truly understand what you taught us over the years. Think of this as your final exam, with Maria serving as motivation for your best possible performance." Elena forced herself to remain calm and analytical, drawing on every technique she had developed for managing high-stress interviews with dangerous subjects. "What do you want from me? You have my attention. You've demonstrated your coordination and planning abilities. What's the endgame here?" Thomas Crane smiled with genuine warmth, the expression Elena remembered from their early interviews when she still believed she was helping him process his psychological development. "The endgame, dear Elena, is education. You've spent 20 years studying us like laboratory specimens, documenting our thoughts and behaviors for your books and lectures. Now we want to study you. We want to understand what it feels like to be the subject instead of the researcher." David Hoffman activated recording equipment and pulled out a chair designed to replicate the interrogation setup Elena had used in hundreds of interviews. "Please have a seat, Dr. Vasquez. We have quite a few questions about your methodology, your motivations, and your psychological responses to stress. Consider this a peer review of your life's work." Elena sat in the chair and looked at Maria, who was watching the proceedings with a mixture of terror and confusion. Elena realized that her daughter was about to witness either the culmination of her mother's career or its final catastrophic failure. There was no middle ground. Elena would either use everything she had learned about predatory psychology to outmaneuver 4 of the most dangerous men she had ever studied, or she and Maria would become the final victims in a network she had inadvertently created. "Before we begin," Elena said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "I want you to know that I understand exactly what this is about. You've created an experiment designed to prove that you've learned to be better predators than I ever imagined. But you've made one crucial miscalculation in your research design." Marcus Webb raised an eyebrow with genuine curiosity. "And what would that be, Professor?" Elena smiled for the first time since arriving at the warehouse, the expression carrying 20 years of experience studying men exactly like these. "You assumed I came here to save Maria, but I actually came here to finish what I started 20 years ago, to study serial killers in their natural environment. The difference is that now I don't have to pretend to be objective about wanting to see you destroyed." Elena's psychological gambit worked exactly as she had calculated. By reframing the situation as her continuing research rather than their revenge fantasy, she forced her captors to reconsider their own motivations and power dynamics. Over the next 3 hours, Elena systematically dismantled the network she had inadvertently created by using the same techniques that had made her the most effective serial killer researcher in the country. But now, with the full understanding that her subjects' lives depended on her ability to outthink men who had been planning this confrontation for years, Elena began by addressing Marcus Webb directly, knowing from her research that he was the natural leader among the group and the one most invested in proving his intellectual superiority. "Marcus, I'm curious about the psychological methodology you've employed here. This elaborate setup suggests months of planning and coordination, which indicates you've moved far beyond the impulsive behavioral patterns we discussed in your original interviews. How did you develop this level of strategic thinking?" Webb's response revealed exactly what Elena had suspected. The escaped killers had been using her research to train each other, sharing psychological insights and developing hybrid approaches that combine techniques from multiple predatory styles. But more importantly, Webb's pride in their achievement made him want to explain their methodology in detail, giving Elena valuable time to analyze their individual psychological states and identify potential weaknesses. Elena noticed that Jeremy Castle was growing increasingly agitated as Webb dominated the conversation, suggesting that the group dynamics were less stable than their coordinated presentation implied. She decided to exploit this tension by directing questions that would highlight the pay differences in their psychological profiles and potentially turn them against each other. "Jeremy, I'm fascinated by your evolution since our last interview," Elena said, shifting her attention away from Webb and noting how Castle immediately straightened with pleasure at being recognized. "The level of discipline required to coordinate this operation suggests you've overcome the impulse control issues we discussed extensively. How did you manage that psychological transformation?" Castle's response confirmed Elena's analysis. He was desperately seeking validation and recognition for his role in orchestrating the kidnapping. More importantly, his need to prove his importance to the group revealed that he felt overshadowed by Webb's leadership and was vulnerable to manipulation through ego appeals and comparisons to his fellow killers. Elena spent the next hour conducting what appeared to be genuine research interviews with each of her captors, asking probing questions about their psychological development, their planning methods, and their interpersonal dynamics. What she was actually doing was gathering intelligence about their current mental states, their individual motivations for participating in the kidnapping, and most crucially, their escape and contingency plans. The breakthrough came when Elena realized that Thomas Crane, the chemistry professor who had initiated the original threat, was showing signs of significant psychological stress despite his calm demeanor. Crane had been in maximum security prison for nearly a decade, and the transition back to complex social interactions with his fellow killers was causing him to question his own role in their group dynamic. "Thomas, I need to ask you about something that's been puzzling me since our phone conversation last week," Elena said, keeping her tone professionally curious rather than accusatory. "Your participation in this operation seems inconsistent with your historical pattern of working alone. What psychological factors influenced your decision to become part of a collaborative effort?" Crane's response was defensive and contradictory, revealing that he was having serious doubts about the wisdom of their plan and his compatibility with the group's approach to predatory behavior. Elena realized that Crane's participation was motivated more by fear of being excluded than by genuine enthusiasm for their revenge fantasy. Elena leveraged this psychological insight by gradually escalating the interview intensity, using techniques she had developed for breaking through defense mechanisms and extracting confessions from reluctant subjects. She started asking questions designed to highlight the contradictions in their planning, the risks they had taken by working together, and the likelihood that their operation would ultimately fail due to interpersonal conflicts. "The most interesting aspect of this entire operation," Elena observed, "is that you've all abandoned the psychological approaches that made you successful killers in favor of a collaborative method that plays against every one of your individual strengths. Marcus, you've always been most effective when working alone and maintaining complete control over variables. Jeremy, your success came from being unpredictable and spontaneous, not from following elaborate plans. David, you specialized in victim isolation and psychological dominance, but sharing control with 3 other alpha personalities completely undermines your methodology. And Thomas, you've always been a perfectionist who avoided unnecessary risks, Yet you've committed to an operation with dozens of potential failure points and multiple opportunities for exposure. Elena watched as her analysis hit each man exactly where she intended. Their professional pride and their confidence in their own predatory abilities. By pointing out how their collaboration had forced them to compromise their individual strengths, Elena was systematically undermining the group cohesion that made them dangerous as a collective threat. The psychological pressure Elena was applying finally cracked Thomas Crane's resolve. "This has gone too far," he said, standing up from his interview station. "I agreed to make contact and frighten her, not to conduct some elaborate research experiment with her daughter as leverage. I'm a killer, not a kidnapper, and I don't work well with others for exactly the reasons she just explained." Elena seized the moment by addressing Crane directly while maintaining her researcher persona. "Thomas, you have the opportunity right now to demonstrate the intellectual superiority that originally attracted me to studying your case. You can choose to end this before it becomes something that's beneath your capabilities, or you can continue participating in an operation that reduces you to being a supporting player in someone else's fantasy." Crane's decision to release Maria and leave the warehouse immediately created the opening Elena had been working toward for hours. With the group dynamic broken and their plan falling apart, the remaining 3 killers were forced to choose between abandoning their revenge fantasy or escalating to violence that would bring immediate law enforcement response. Elena used the confusion to activate the emergency beacon Agent Morrison had insisted she carry, knowing that FBI tactical teams were already positioned around the warehouse. As sirens approached and her remaining captors realized their carefully planned operation had been psychologically dismantled by the woman they thought they had outsmarted, Elena experienced the satisfaction of using 20 years of research to achieve its original purpose, stopping dangerous predators before they could claim more victims. The arrests happened quickly and without violence. Webb, Castle, and Hoffman surrendered immediately when they realized their psychological advantage had evaporated and law enforcement had surrounded the building. Elena held Maria as FBI agents secured the scene, finally understanding that her research had always been about this moment, using her knowledge of predatory behavior to protect innocent people from those who would exploit and harm them. In the months that followed, Elena's testimony helped convict all 4 men on federal kidnapping charges that ensured they would never be released again. More importantly, her experience led to comprehensive reforms in prison, research programs, and communication protocols that prevented future coordination between the incarcerated predators. Elena had turned her professional failure into a triumph that made society safer for everyone. As Elena returned to her research with new safeguards and a deeper understanding of the psychological dynamics between researcher and subject, she realized that her 20-year career had prepared her for this single confrontation. Every interview, every breakthrough, every psychological insight had been leading to the moment when she would need to use her expertise to save her family and stop the network she had inadvertently created. Elena's final research paper, published 6 months after the warehouse incident, was titled "The Student-Teacher Dynamic in Criminal Psychology: How Predators Learn from Their Observers." The paper detailed how her research subjects had systematically gathered intelligence about her personal life, coordinated their activities across multiple institutions, and attempted to use her own methodology against her. But more importantly, it explained how understanding predatory psychology could be used proactively to identify, manipulate, and ultimately neutralize dangerous individuals before they could harm innocent people. Elena's story reveals the terrifying truth about how serial killers think, plan, and adapt, but also how understanding their psychology can be used to stop them. If this deep dive into criminal psychology opened your eyes to the hidden dangers lurking in our society, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more true crime stories that expose the dark realities most people never see. Share this story with someone who needs to understand how predators really operate, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Elena was right to risk everything to save her daughter, or should she have trusted law enforcement to handle the situation? Your answer might reveal more about human nature than you realize. The psychology of evil is more complex than most people understand, but knowledge is our best defense against those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability.